So David was a Sunday morning presenter at SciCon, which is a very prestigious thing to be able to do. Carolyn was another one. And it is a vigorous, I guess you would say, vigorous vetting and
toughest peer review I've ever had.
It's Rob Palmer and I went through who was going to be able to present it. I don't know why, but SciCon, this big conference in Vegas, gave Rob Palmer and myself the ability to pick 6 speakers to do a presentation for over 2 hours, 6 people, even spread out, at this huge conference in front of about 400 people. And so it was, I don't know, but we had fun with it. And David was one of the people selected as well as Carolyn. And it was really fun working with David because this guy's brilliant and I'm a baby photographer. And so here I am telling him, okay, I want your slide to look like this. Okay, change it this way. Now I keep making them do the slides over and over again, or the Zoom presentation over and over again to refine it. And he was so polite and he was just so awesome. He's like, okay, sure, I'll take care of that. Okay. What a nice guy. So when he said, I see you're going to be doing a Skeptic Camp conference in Monterey the first part of January, I think I can arrange it so that I can be there. Can I give my presentation? I'm like, absolutely. So if you decide to come to the Skeptic Camp that will be in Albuquerque, New Mexico, hopefully in early June, hopefully David will also be there giving presentations and helping run that group, because you're brand new to the Albuquerque Skeptics. He's from Wisconsin, right?
Most recently.
Yeah, so this is wonderful. So seriously, he flew out a couple days ago to Oakland, rented a car, and brought a car, and he's down here for a couple days, and then he's going to go back home tomorrow. And I'm just really pleased that you're able to get this. And you're not talking about drones, right? There's no drones in your presentation today. So I'm just checking, and no rocks that are radiated or.
We'll see what happens.
Okay, so all right. So we are ahead of time. So if you have questions you'd like to ask, please do so. He writes for Science-Based Medicine, which is a kind of a sister project out of the Center for Inquiry and the Skeptical Inquiry community, which is a very important part of the world of scientific skepticism. So I give you David.
Thanks a lot. It's really great to be here. This is sort of a director's cut version of the talk I gave at SciCon. I don't have the draconian time restrictions that Conrad Weinberg put on me. So this is kind of my narrative of a story that I think is a recurrent story throughout history, where a certain set of circumstances are kind of the perfect storm for scientific frauds to kind of emerge. It's the emergence of a new science and very high expectations for results from these new endeavors, but science doesn't always keep up with the expectations, and it's really easy for charlatans to step in and kind of take advantage of that. And oftentimes the regulatory environment hasn't quite caught up with the new science. And this has also been emerged 2 aspects of my life, my professional life as a now retired academic physician. I was an ophthalmologist, a retina specialist, and my recently acquired hobby of collecting antique medical artifacts. And as I was putting this together, it actually occurred to me that this is an anniversary of when I started this hobby. I can identify this particular object as the first item in my collection, and it happened on New Year's Day, I think it was 9 or 10 years ago. I saw this box at an antique mall that had an open house on New Year's Day. And I saw it, I opened it, I walked away. I didn't know quite what it was, but I ended up bringing it home with me. And this is what I bought. This is called the violet ray device. These were all the rage in like the 1920s. And at that time, electricity was kind of a novel thing. Only about half of American households had electricity in their house. And these things were sold. This is a very high voltage device. It takes household electricity and converts it to very high voltage alternating current, and you stick these glass devices, these glass vacuum tubes, or they're gas-filled tubes, into this hand device, and it glows this vivid purple. And if you put your finger next to it, it'll arc, you'll get this big electrical arc. And if you touch it, you kind of feel this tingling electrical shock sensation. And these were really the cure-all. There were wands for these things to go over every portion of your body and into every orifice that you can imagine. I've seen the catalogs. So these were, and if you look on eBay, these must have been very possible because there's dozens of them for sale on eBay. I happened to find a very nice specimen that was complete with all the wands intact. So this is one of the advertisements for this device, and you can't quite see it, but pretty much every disease you might have is represented here. Just one more, I have to share one more item. This is one of the oldest bottles I have in my collection. This was called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. And this was marketed to mothers with fussy babies. And this was to quiet down fussy babies, in particular teething babies or colicky babies. The idea was you would give them this substance and they would sleep or be quiet for a while. And these advertisements were very, very popular. It almost always showed these really quiet, well-behaved children and these very content mothers. And I really like this advertisement because she's reading to her children, there's a bottle of the cure here, and she's actually reading an advertisement for the... And on the left is a picture of these children, and there's one here that's fallen asleep, quietly asleep. And this, one of the reasons why this cure was so popular is because it really did work. It had a secret ingredient. And pretty much all medicines there were secret ingredients because there was no expectations that medicines would list their contents. And the secret ingredient in this was alcohol with a chaser of morphine.
Oh,
No, for real, this stuff had lots of morphine. And if you compare the dose of morphine in that to the current recommendation for pediatric doses of morphine, it's about 6-fold higher.
Wow.
So we don't really know what the consequences are, but it's estimated that hundreds, if not thousands of kids, some of them actually woke up from these naps. It's believed that many, many children were poisoned and died of, turns out morphine overdose is a really good way to get your kid quiet. Wow. So this brings me to one of these stories for today's talk. This is one of the bottles in my collection, and I bought it really because I was intrigued by the imagery on the bottle. It's hard to really project that, but there's and then this is the first story, and then the second story is a recent story from my own medical experience, and that's reported in this New England Journal of Medicine article. And this will give me an opportunity to introduce these two characters, these two medical entrepreneurs that never really met but probably would have a lot to talk about. So we'll start in the 19th century, the first attempt to cure all diseases. Now you can listen to this talk as a story about medical entrepreneurs and charlatans, or you can see it as a time when the deep state canceled heterodox medical opinions in 2 different centuries. It's a choose your own adventure. But this one occurred in the 19th century, and you have to understand the context for this was germ theory of disease. And in the early to middle part of the 19th century was when germ theory really emerged as a working model of medical disease, and it was recognized that certain diseases were caused by specific microbes. And theoretically, those diseases could be treated if you could cure those microbes. But there was a long gap between understanding of the germ theory to when antibiotics were discovered about 40 years later. But there's one point in this timeline that they don't teach you we didn't learn in medical school or in history books. And that is in 1986, a gentleman in Texas cured all diseases.
wow.
This man is named William Radham. He was a gardener in Austin, Texas. And he wasn't a a scientist. He wasn't formally trained in science or medicine or microbiology, but he was a kind of a super fan of germ theory. And he extended germ theory, and in his mind, all diseases were caused by microbes. And his gift to the world was his microbe killer, which he patented in 1886. And he had great commercial success. This really took off. He had manufacturing plants across the United States and even overseas. And he was able to move from his humble beginnings in Austin, Texas, to a mansion in Manhattan. And his business was successful for about 30 years. This is the bottle that kind of got me interested in this story, and it's easier to see the image on the left side, or the right side of the screen. And his trademark was a man in a business suit, kind of in mortal combat with the Grim Reaper. And his humble tagline, cures all diseases, and he really meant it. This is a print ad, and you didn't want to be any fraudulent imitators. You wanted to get the microbe killer. There were imitators, and actually this is a logo from a competitive product. And from my understanding, actually, this preceded his logo of the combat between the hero and death. He wrote a book, and despite the fact that he wasn't a trained scientist, he could speak pretty credibly on germ theory. This book was self-published. It was full of photomicrographs of various microbes. It spoke on separation of church and state and First Amendment, and was recognized as one of the finest speakers of his day.
The Great Agnostic?
The Great Agnostic. That's it. So he went to court against Eccles, hired Ingersoll. He lost that case and fired Robert Green Ingersoll. I don't know who he hired next, but these two went back and forth in the courts for years. In the end, it wasn't Mr. Eccles that took him down, it was the U.S. government. There were lots of snake oils available at the time, and finally the government put in some regulations. The first really attempt to regulate medications in the U.S. was the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. But that really only dealt with labeling, truthful labeling of ingredients. It wasn't until 1912 that the Shirley Amendment prevented false therapeutic claims, and the microbe killer was really one of the first targets of that law. And they quickly put him out. They seized his inventory and pretty much put him out of business. So that was the end of a 30-year successful business. So now we come to the 21st century, and it's a similar but new story. And this is in the context of stem cells. I didn't go much into detail about stem cells, but I don't know how familiar people are with stem cells. Stem cells are cells that in our body or in our development that are capable of differentiating and growing into other types of cells. In the world of stem cells, they talk about potency, and potency really means the versatility of the stem cell. So the ultimate stem cell is the zygote, the fertilized egg, which ultimately differentiates into the cells of the placenta as well as all the cells in the embryo and ultimately the adult. And stem cells range from totipotent, meaning that they can differentiate anything, to very limited potential. So the ones in green are what are considered embryonic stem cells, and there are stem cells even in adults, but they're fewer and more limited in what they can do. And so we've known about stem cells for a long time, but there were some really important discoveries at the beginning of this century in how to understanding stem cells and specifically manipulating stem cells in ways that they may actually be useful as therapies, as medicines. This didn't go unrecognized. This was a Time magazine article from 2009, hyping stem cells as sort of the next scientific miracle. It's going to be the fountain of youth, the cure to all diseases. And Time magazine wasn't alone. Pretty much every periodical had a cover like this. Despite the promise of stem cells, and there's still a lot of research, and they still are very promising, progress has been pretty slow. We really haven't seen them come to their full potential yet. However, that hasn't prevented see something in your Sunday paper advertising these direct-to-consumer stem cells. And for the most part, what they're selling is based on very, very flimsy evidence. This was kind of all background noise to me until an article that appeared in 2017. And this is the article. This would get really close to home. I was currently in practice as a retina specialist, so I saw patients every day with a condition called age-related macular degeneration. It's a pretty scary disease, and in some cases, pretty devastating disease. This one article described 3 women who sought treatment at a stem cell clinic in Florida for their macular degeneration. And the consequences of that treatment were pretty tragic. And not only am I familiar with patients like this, I know some of the authors of this article who practice medicine in Florida. So this is the place that they sought treatment. This company was formerly known as BioMart. They now go by the name of US Stem Cell, and they're in a place called Sunrise, Florida. At the time of these events, the chief scientific officer for this company was named Kristen Camillo. And Ms. Camillo was really kind of a superstar in the regenerative medicine community. She was a highly sought-after speaker. She was touted as an expert in regenerative medicine and stem cells. Much like Mr. Radham, she really wasn't formally trained in medicine or biology. And despite being the chief scientific officer for a biomedical company, she had no formal biomedical training. She didn't have a degree in biology or medicine at all, at least not at that time. But she could speak pretty articulately about it and very persuasively, and she was an excellent evangelist for the company. She was very much the voice and the face of the company. And just to point out, if you look at this, this is a screenshot from their website. They tout themselves as a world leader in research and development of stem cell science. And I was able to find some of their financials. According to SEC filings, they had a multi-million-dollar annual budget. And the budget that they had allocated to research was about $6,000, so a tiny fraction of a percent of their budget. And just to put things in context at the time, for about the cost of the value of their research, you could buy a 15-year-old Prius. So that was how much they valued research. But they were very positive on stem cell treatment, and this is a partial list of the many diseases that they claim to have success in treating. And I found there was a video interview of the chief scientific officer, and she said, any organ or tissue inside the body that needs healing. Pretty much the same sentiment as cures all diseases. So what exactly treatment did these patients have? They kind of had a standard treatment that they used, and they would just make up their treatment of stem cells and inject them into whatever part of the body that they were trying to treat at the time. So they favored a treatment called adipose-derived stem cells. Adipose refers to fat tissue. So these patients would come in, they would pay their money and I was seeing it was between $5,000 and $7,000. They would have liposuction done, meaning a big needle was inserted into their subcutaneous belly fat, and that tissue was sucked out. That's what liposuction is. And it was processed in a variety of ways. It was homogenized, and it was treated with enzymes and separated. Then put in a centrifuge and spun down, and the very bottom of that centrifuge tube is a material called in the industry stromal vascular fraction, and that's where the stem cells supposedly resided. There might have been some stem cells in there. For treating the eye, they were the wrong kind of stem cells, if they were to the extent that they existed at all. And then they drew blood, they spun that down, and they take a part from the blood called platelet-rich plasma. Platelet-rich plasma doesn't contain stem cells, but it's kind of the secret sauce to a lot of regenerative medicine treatment. If you've heard about vampire facials, that was kind of popular for a while. That's what they're using in these vampire facials. So they would take that together, stuff together, mix it together, put it in a syringe, and then inject it into whatever body part they were intending to treat. So just to make it clear, these materials were processed, but they were really purified. The stem cells weren't purified. This mush kind of contained a variety of cells and enzymes and some of the reagents they used to process these tissues mixed together in a syringe, and then, in the particular case of these patients, injected into the patient's eye, literally into the back of the eye. What these folks didn't know, but probably should have known, is the eye is very unforgiving to having foreign material injected. There's a lot of, there are multiple examples of things that can safely be injected to almost any space in the body that is not well tolerated at all in the eye. And these poor women rapidly underwent, yes?
Were they told that this was a clinical trial?
That's an interesting one. Well, I'll circle back to that at the end, because that's an interesting question. I don't know what they were told. I know it's been alleged that they were told. And remind me to get back to that at the end. But these women underwent these rapid spiraling complications. And to put things in context, these women did have, at least allegedly have a condition called macular degeneration. But they actually had pretty good vision. They had very functional vision. So I looked it up, and each woman had sufficient vision to have a driver's license. So they weren't really severely impaired. Within a couple weeks after this treatment, they were all legally blind. Each one of these three women was legally blind. And the most severely affected woman was legally blind to the point where she had no perception of light in either eye. So, completely lights out the eye. That never happens in the natural history of macular degeneration.
Wow.
So, who's in charge and how did this happen? Well, they talk about this as the gray area in stem cells. The FDA does have regulations about how biological tissues can be used, in what circumstances they are regulated, and under certain circumstances they're exempt. To be perfectly honest, the language around this is pretty ambiguous, and these clinics just interpret the regulations to declare themselves exempt. And the FDA has done I wouldn't say they've done their best, but they've tried to clarify the regulations, but they've rarely gone after individual providers. They did make an exception here. The article was published in 2017, but there were preprints of this article in 2016. And in April 2017, the FDA showed up and knocked on the door of this place for a surprise inspection. First, they weren't allowed entry, but they eventually got access to the facilities. The FDA, a couple months later, issued a warning letter. And if you're in the business and under jurisdiction of FDA, you don't want to get an FDA warning letter. And it alleged that what they were doing was not exempt from regulation, that they were basically, this was a drug, these stem cells were a drug, and they cited them for numerous violations. U.S. Stem Cell was defiant. They declared that FDA was wrong, that they had misinterpreted their own regulations, and that what they were doing was in the interest of the patients, and they weren't going to stop. Finally, the FDA went through the courts, and they filed legal action against U.S. Stem Cell, and ultimately a judge ruled in the favor of the FDA, and they finally did have to cease this particular practice. Now, the company's still in operation, but they're no longer doing this type of treatment. And the company and their chief scientific officer have parted ways. So besides the obvious, what went wrong here? And could this have been prevented? And I think it could have and should have been prevented. First of all, despite claiming that they were interested in research, they did no research on this that I can determine. They went directly to a fee-for-service model, which means that they skipped any preclinical research. Generally, before you're going to introduce a new treatment in a new organ, you do some preclinical research, animal models possibly, safety studies. They did none of that. And the thing that made this even more tragic, it's pretty much a practice. If you're going to do a new treatment, since people have two eyes, you generally, until the safety and the efficacy of the new treatment is established, you treat one eye at a time. But but they opted to treat both of these patients, what we call bilateral treatment. These patients were treated the same day in both eyes. And I would argue that there was low, understanding what I know about eyes and about stem cells and whatever, I think there was a very low plausibility that this was going to help anybody. And I think there was a high plausibility for harm. And I'll go into that a little bit more. But what really came down to, they didn't know what they didn't know. From what I can gather, there was nobody in their inner circle that knew anything about ocular anatomy or physiology or toxicology or the things you would want to know about. And as best I can determine, they really didn't engage any outside experts to help them. When I say there was a high plausibility for harm, I don't just mean that there was lack of safety. I mean that there was affirmative data that this was not a safe thing to do. I was just talking to a woman who's a medical librarian. There are ways to research literature that's been done before to see if anybody's done anything like this before. But Google can actually do this fairly easily sometimes. And if you enter the search term platelet-rich plasma, which is one of the ingredients in their treatment, and intravitreal injection, which is how they deliver this drug, there are results that come up just under Google. And this is one of the articles that it took me about 30 seconds to find this. This was a rabbit model where they injected platelet-rich plasma into the eyes of rabbits. And unfortunately, these rabbits behaved much the same as these women did. And then if you follow the citations here, you find another pig model where they did very similar research and had very similar results. So there was really good reason to believe this was not a safe way to go. And I suspect the other components were just as dangerous, but this is where there's an established track record in the literature. So, in the time that they were being inspected or being sued by the FDA, they underwent a public relations and fundraising effort, and this was a video they released of the United States versus Kristen Camilla, and it talked about all the tremendous successes that they had with treating patients with stem cells, and they unfortunately had these few adverse events, and the real victim were the patients and the scientists of this company. It's really hard to watch this video. You can see the tears in the image on the right as the real victims are being revealed. So back to our timeline. 2017 was when this article was published. There was about the same time a researcher tried to estimate how many direct-to-consumer stem cell clinics there were in the United States. And at that time, they found 570. 2019 was when the courts and the FDA finally prevailed over this one stem cell clinic. And unfortunately, in 2021, the number of direct-to-consumer stem cell clinics had increased almost fivefold. So I'm not sure the regulators are winning yet. And again, there's still, numerous direct-to-consumer stem cell clinics. And this quote, "History doesn't repeat itself, but often rhymes," is often, I think, misattributed to Mark Twain. I don't think we know who actually said this, but I think it's a fitting quote. And so the pattern I see here is an emergence, science emerges, it captures a lot of hype and attention, expectations are very high. But sometimes science doesn't keep up with expectations, and the progress doesn't keep pace with the expectations, and that creates the opportunity for charlatans to kind of step in and fill the vacuum. Unfortunately, sometimes people get hurt and the regulators can't quite keep up with the vacuum. I wrote several articles about these events in Science-Based Medicine and in the UK version of the Skeptics magazine. If you don't read Science-Based Medicine, I highly recommend it. It's a collective blog of current information on issues in medicine and science, and it's meant for a lay audience. Specifically about stem cells, there are some good resources for consumers on stem cells. The International Society for Stem Cell Research is a good organization. They have a lot of public-facing information, good, trustworthy information about stem And there's a little more technical side. There's a researcher at UC Davis named Paul Knopfler. He is a stem cell researcher himself. He's been a very vocal advocate for responsible use of stem cells both in the clinic and in the research lab. And he has a blog and a newsletter called The Niche, which really is how I kind of keep up with current issues in stem cell science, both the good and the bad. And you can see my dog is about as enthusiastic about the coming year as I am. I'll go back to the question about the question was asked, were these patients led to believe that they were in clinical trial or in research? That's a really interesting question. The former version of this company called BioHeart had made a very public point that they were going to do clinical trials on stem cells and macular degeneration. They had filed an entry on a website called clinicaltrials.gov, which is a site where clinical trials are supposed to be registered. They never initiated that trial. These patients would not have been eligible for the trial as they had proposed it. So according to clinicaltrials.gov, they never initiated that trial. They enrolled 0 patients into that trial. Like I said, they went directly to a fee-for-service model. But once those entries go into clinicaltrials.gov, patients peruse those sites to look for clinical trials, and it is alleged that some of the patients that sought treatment there believed that they were in a clinical trial. They got access to the clinic through clinicaltrials.gov, and that they believed, whether they were led to believe that or not, or they led themselves to believe it, but at least some of them felt that they were in a research trial.
Were there any doctors involved?
Yes. So there was a physician. She was not a researcher. She was a community ophthalmologist who, I don't know if it's true, but supposedly met Kristen Camilla at their gym. That they went to the same gym. Because they did need a doctor. These injections can't be done by just a technician. So that she was the one that they had engaged. When they announced that they were going to do the clinical trial, she was the principal, she was the listed principal investigator on the trial. She admitted that she really had no experience in research, or she wasn't a retina specialist. And I think she was the one that gave the injections, at least for some of these women. So she was involved, but I don't think she had much to do with the treatment.
Is there something called FDA approved?
Yes, well, for this, like I said, they call it, the question is there anything called FDA approved? This is kind of what they call the gray area, because FDA regulations are ambiguous, and these clinics have just interpreted the regulations in a way that they have declared themselves exempt. And honestly, the FDA has been a little slow to step in. Like I said, there have been a few examples in recent years now where they have actually gone and inspected various clinics and made declarations about whether what they were doing was legal or not. But the FDA has, a lot of people have been critical of the FDA's kind of inaction in this area. Lots of questions. First-hand went up back there.
How are these companies and associated doctors avoiding civil liability for this obviously causing harm?
So there were several lawsuits that came. They're not protected from civil liability. There were several lawsuits, at least 3 that I know of, against this clinic by some of these women. And I believe that at least some of the women did get pretty large rewards. But I think the results are sealed, so I don't know what the terms were.
Maybe put a little slightly more positive spin. Is there any optimism you have about stem cell research?
Yeah. The question is, do I have optimism about stem cell research? I think stem cells have been slower and harder to harness as a treatment than people expected. I think there is potential for stem cells to yield good results, but I think it's going to be very slow. I think for this particular indication, I think it's going to be, for eye disease, I think it's going to be difficult, but there are a lot of people working on it. It is a very, very hot area for research. Yes.
You mentioned there are something like 2,700 direct-to-consumer operations right now. Are any of them legitimate?
We're recording, so.
Define legitimate.
Something that, given enough time and funding, the FDA wouldn't shut down.
I think they've shifted away from the more controversial types of treatments like these that are more ambiguous. In terms of legitimate, I think the scientific basis, their evidence for the treatments they're giving is very flimsy, just because maybe they work, but nobody's bothered to do the kind of research that you can really make that judgment. For the most part, the most common thing that they're treating are like orthopedic. They're injecting this stuff into knee, where it probably is not doing a ton of harm, and they're claiming they have good results, but the quality of the studies that are releasing is pretty poor. Yes?
So I have one comment and one question. The comment is that I think it is human nature that when something new and promising comes and people see it as like the biggest solution, the thing that will resolve everything. And that's just not medicine. And it happens to a lot of other practices. So that's something that's all within us, to give too much value to something that has not moved to something. And
I agree with you.
so the question is that for these 3 women who got blind, are there other patients who receive the same treatment, or just the 3 women who have the treatment?
Well, we know subsequent to this one report in the New England Journal, there were a couple other case reports from either patients treated at the same clinic or kind of disciples of this clinic that were treated and had similar unfortunate outcomes. We don't know the total number of patients that were treated, if it was all the patients they treated or just a fraction. They haven't disclosed that information, at least that I'm aware of.
But that's important, isn't it? If 100 people get the same treatment, and 97 of them got really good result, and only 3 got blind.
So let me just, the comment was that it's human nature for people to be enthusiastic about these new treatments, but we should kind of temper the expectations, and I agree with that. And the other one is it would be nice to know what portion of the patients who were treated were harmed. It's almost like responsible researchers would disclose that information, but you can draw whatever conclusions you wish, but we don't know that information. At least I'm not aware that anybody knows that.
Wow.
Any other questions? Yes.
What is it about liposuction and platelets? Why do they think it would work?
Well, I think liposuction is just a fairly accessible, easy way to harvest something that they can call stem cells. And the platelet-rich plasma, that's, like I said, that's kind of the secret sauce of a lot of these regenerative medicines clinics. It's easy to get, it's inexpensive to harvest.
So they were
they seem to think it has magic properties.
They were strapping a mirror to their forehead to dress like a doctor.
Yeah.